Champions of evolution and science who may be carrying a cell phone with you. And if you are, would you be so kind as to shut it off? Welcome to Sacramento's 15th annual Darwin Birthday Gala. On behalf of all of us volunteers, the organizing committee whose names you will see on the back of your program, all who have helped, if you would stand up and let us see you and let's all applaud. These people put in a lot of work. Thank you. We are a gathering of Sacramento science enthusiasts. We're commemorating Darwin Day as a toast to the common good of all humanity. It is the 203rd anniversary of someone who was and remains a scientific giant. The vast proportion of scientists think that his theory of evolution through natural selection is about the most powerful scientific theory ever developed. Our event here in Sacramento is one of many events that's taking place now in communities around the nation and in other parts of the world as well. There's lectures, there are sermons, museum exhibitions, parties, film showings. All of these events honor in some way Charles Darwin's accomplishments and his contribution to human understanding. We are interested in what brings you to the event today. We placed an ad for today's event in Tuesday's Sacramento Bee. And if your decision to attend today was triggered by seeing that ad, we would love to know it. Would you please raise your hand? Somebody's doing a count. Somebody better be quick.
Okay, I don't need an exact one, but that's good enough.
Thank you very much. Now, we also placed an ad in the Sacramento News and Review that came out on Thursday. And if that's what triggered you to come to this event, would you please raise your hand? Okay. And we also had an article come out yesterday in the Sacramento Bee. We didn't pay for that one, it just came. And so if that drew you here, if you saw it and that drew you here, would you please kind of put up your hand? Well, I'm pleased you all made it here somehow. Charles Darwin has become a symbol of scientific advancement that can and should be promoting a common bond among all of the Earth's people and not division. Unfortunately, that was somewhat illustrated in yesterday's Bee article. We want our Darwin Day event here in Sacramento to be a community-wide event. We want to emphasize the common bond of humanity and particularly the one between religion and secularism, that this division has continued to impede our progress. And it's important to recognize that the great diversity of folks who do appreciate evolutionary theory and how important it has been to advancing human understanding. We have a common interest with all of you who care about science, religious and non-religious. We welcome science enthusiasts of every stripe, and particularly educators, because at this event, we also promote and defend sound science education in curricula and public school programs. And with climate change rapidly gaining speed and anti-environmental regulation lawmakers denying its impact, a true grasp of science is really important. Besides the college-level science departments that endorse our educational gala, attending today, we have members of representatives from some nonprofits. So I hope that you will visit all of the tables and see their wares. And also, if you feel like taking home something about Darwin or about Darwin Day, then make sure you visit the sales table over there. The event is sponsored by all of the groups that are listed on the front page of your program. And represented here today of the nonprofits, we have the National Center for Science Education. Glenn Branch is there, wave. And Camp Quest West, back in the back, David Diskin. The Humanist Association of the Greater Sacramento Area, Bill Potts. The Atheists and Other Free Thinkers, Ken Nahigian. The Brights Net, Kelly Karras. The Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Jack Castor. And so we really do appreciate all of those. Do we have the American Civil Liberties Union? Did she show up? Yay! There they are in the back. Thank you. So if you haven't had a look around the tables, make sure you visit those after the presentation. We call our event an educational gala, and the important thing about it is to educate, so we have a program to do that. And then after we kind of turn on your brains to science, we're going to follow it off with some refreshments. We're going to ask you please to refrain from those refreshments until after the question and answer period has been completed, so don't be hustling back there too early. And we want you to make sure you check out those cartoons along the wall there to kind of get in the lighthearted mood. We all have to leave at 4:45. So if you get to chatting after the refreshments, make sure that you keep your eye on the clock. We all have to clean up and close the doors, and so everybody needs to start going at 4:45. Now we're going to get going with some music to celebrate science. We don't want it all just to be about our brains. We want a little bit of fun here. So we have a Sacramento singing group, the Mockingbirds. They're all dressed in their choir robes. And so I'd like to introduce Andy and her crew, and we're going to have kick off this event with some music. Thank you.
Just have to rearrange the mics a little bit. I'll show you how we're going to be, and then you can fix the mics.
They're ready.
Move the other microphones over.
I thought you just said it wasn't on.
Until you move it.
Oh, okay.
They make noise when they move.
Let's move that one down. We'll have them all right here in front of me.
Not close. Okay, we're gonna run.
Hi everyone, we are so excited to be here for Darwin Day. 203rd birthday? That's old. Hope I live that long. We are the Mockingbirds, and we love to mock traditional songs with different words. So sometimes you recognize some of our songs, but we've changed the words. We have 2 original ones we like to do for you, and we've written them especially for today. So I hope you enjoy.
Charles Edward Darwin, we celebrate this day. He wrote the books that changed our views in a most exciting way. Origin of Species, the descent geologist and a beetle collecting fan. Read the books of knowledge, take what they can give. Science helps us understand the world in which we live. Testing out new theories, reaching for the stars. Science put a man in space and looked for life on Mars. Look what we've discovered. Look what we have found. Penicillin, DNA, X-rays and ultrasound. Periodic table, quantum theory too. So celebrate on Darwin Day what science gives to you.
As you can see, they're about Darwin. Tune up again.
Oh, what a concept, my mind is mine. I simply evolved here without a design. Homo erectus, Neanderthal. There was Cro-Magnon, now we walk tall. This is our story, this is our song. Man's evolution, 2 million years long. This is our story, this is our song. Learn how a theory proved creation wrong. Darwin applied evolution to man. It frightened the people, cause there was no plan. It challenged their dogma, their faith that they knew. But science has shown us this theory is true. This is our story, this is our song. Man's evolution, 2 million years long. This is our story, this is our song. Learn how a theory proved creation wrong. Natural selection has passed every test. No matter how loudly the people protest. Celebrate science, what we have found. Discover new theories, breaking new ground. This is our story, this is our song. Man's evolution, 2 million years long. This is our story, this is our song. Learn how a theory proved creation wrong. Learn how a theory proved creation wrong, 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 wrong.
Oh, now I'm by myself. We have one more song to do with our little subgroup. And some of you might have remembered, I think, Minga, where are you? You've done it before. It's a song done by Chumbawamba. And it's about Charles Darwin, but they call him Charlie in this song. Guys ready?
Closer to the microphone.
You want me to raise it?
That'd be good.
I thought I was talking to Roger back there. I don't know how to do it. I'm blonde. Or at least I was at one point. Nobody knows for sure. makes us look smart. Thanks for helping. While he's doing that, I'll let you know that we are open for more people to join us. We meet on Monday nights over in Folsom. And starting tomorrow, we start work on our pirate songs for the big Flying Spaghetti Monster Party coming up in April. So if you like to sing, come on down.
Okay? All right. Levels are still down, so wait until I get there.
He says cut.
By hand of the designer comes our Charlie, spins the world from back to Asia Minor. In between the platypus and perfect Aphrodite, Charlie come with opposing thumb to question the Almighty. Over the river and over the sea, through holy storm and thunder, steer a course for a brave new world of common sense and wonder. Teacher, jump into the music of the wealthy Midwest preacher. Charlie, come with a brand new dance, get on the floor and follow. Find yourself a partner and we'll swing into tomorrow. Over the river and over the sea, through holy storm and thunder, steer a course for a brave new world of common sense and wonder. Stepping out, come join the worldwide party. Charge your glass and beat the world. We'll drink a toast to Charlie. Over the river and over the sea, through holy storm and thunder, steer a course for a brave new world of common sense and wonder. Over the river and over the sea, through holy storm and thunder, steer a course for a brave new world of common sense and wonder. Over the river and over the sea, through holy storm and thunder, steer a course for a brave new world of common sense and wonder.
Outfit here. Hi everybody, how y'all doing? We're doing good. Fantastic. If any of my former students are here, I want to say good for you. If any of my present students are here, I want to remind you I do not give extra credit out. This is the 203rd anniversary of Charles Darwin's birthday. We've been doing the Darwin Day event here for 15 years. I was going to say 13. So it started before I came here, so before my time. I want to introduce our speaker for this particular year. I'll steal your podium for a moment if you don't mind.
Can you use the mic, Liam?
Which one? I'm afraid to touch them now.
Somehow we'll have surround sound.
Okay. right, if there's an explosion of sparks, you'll know what happened. Okay, how's that? Really? I thought it was loud enough normally. Okay. You can hear me now, right? No cell phone jokes, I promise. All right. Dr. Peter Hess earned his M.A. in Philosophy and Theology from Oxford University in 1984 and his Ph.D. in Historical Theology from the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley in 1993. He is presently the director of the Religious Community Outreach Center at the National Center for Science Education, or as I know it, NCSC. And his scholarly work focuses on the complex interactions between science and religion in early modern Europe, particularly on the impact of science on natural theology, which probably goes back to William Paley, I'm assuming, from the original Argument from Design. Yeah. So the appropriation of the developing sciences by theologians during this period. He has taught theology at the University of San Francisco and other Bay Area institutions since 1985 and was associate program director of the Science and Religious Course Program at the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences in Berkeley, California. He and his wife Vivienne have two sons, Michael and Robert, and he is an avid mountaineer and rock climber. He's going to talk to us today about the intersections between religion, specifically, I'm assuming, Western European religion, and science at the interface of evolution, which ultimately was the thing that Darwin first kind of had to get the ball rolling on that. If you recall, when Darwin started out, he wasn't a Darwinist, if that makes any sense. So, without any further ado, here's Dr. Hess. I also want to apologize for all the technical issues. We've only been doing this for 15 years.
I don't know whether the mic is on yet.
No.
Okay, is it on now? No? Mic check? Okay, that's on. Okay, well, I'd like to begin by saying how much I appreciated the music of the Mockingbirds. And the only time that I've been on YouTube, and I think I'm still there, was when the National Center for Science Education did a birthday party for Charles Darwin 3 years ago, and we all sat around our cake singing, and so I have about 30 seconds on YouTube. But I must say, it was absolutely incredible to hear the Mockingbirds. I'm going to ask our organist if we can use those words for that first hymn next Sunday. We'll see how far I get. It is interesting, however, that today around the country and around the world, there are thousands of congregations, Christian, Jewish, and I don't know about Muslim, but we now have a number of Muslim signers to the Imam Letter Project, part of the Clergy Letter Project. When I asked a local priest whether he was going to be incorporating evolution into services for today, he said, well, I'm not sure why I would, any more than why I would include a special Gravity Sunday. He said, I assume the truth of evolution as much as I assume gravity or quantum mechanics. So just like we don't have a quantum mechanics Sunday or a gravity Sunday, we don't have an evolution Sunday because it is thoroughly incorporated into our way of thinking. And I thought, well, that's the kind of pastor we need a lot more of. Someone who has already integrated evolutionary thinking into his theology to such a degree that it is simply assumed as second nature. The National Center for Science Education is sometimes, and NCSE is sometimes pilloried as the National Center for Selling Evolution by creationists who think that we're simply out there to give a snow job. And we've actually just added a climate person full-time because now we're finding that there's a common cause between climate change deniers and evolution deniers and even vaccine deniers. And I think a couple of weeks ago I read an article, and maybe I'm wrong, but that there's a group here at Carmichael that put up a billboard advertising you should not inoculate your children against whooping cough because it causes autism. And so I'm sure you're all aware that there's a good deal of science denial of all sorts. And so life at NCSE is always a challenge and exciting. We never know what we're going to get from day to day, just like these dinosaurs. You've probably seen this cartoon. Which is a very nice way to account for why the dinosaurs didn't make it onto the ark. So at NCSE, we do a number of tasks. We promote and defend the teaching of evolution in public schools. We interact with scholars and the public in the interdisciplinary area of religion and science. Well, that's particularly what I do as religion director of outreach to religious communities. We convince religious communities that evolution is not necessarily inimical to their faith, although I don't often get the opportunity to talk to fundamentalists. They email us vitriolic posts, which, if you've ever visited NCSE, you know the best of them will end up on our bathroom wall. We have this incredible bathroom wall that it takes people half an hour to get out of the bathroom when they first come. Because we have all of our best pieces of vitriol taped up there, as well as, of course, on one wall, all of the great encomia that we receive from supporters. I also work to convince the scientific community that many religious believers, in fact, accept science. And I have numerous friends, including Catholic priests, who are evolutionary biologists. And I have to point out to fundamentalists, if you're arguing that to be a scientist means that you're necessarily hostile to religion, you have to take into account why are there Jesuits who are practicing evolutionary biology. Then the fundamentalists, of course, will say, well, they're not Christian if they're Jesuit. And now we are attempting to convince the skeptical public that climate change is in fact real, substantial, and perilous to the future of polar bears. I mention polar bears because my son Robert yesterday, on the way back from his last basketball game of the season, where he had a magnificent three-pointer at the last moment to bring our losing score 21 against the winner 51. A very large Oakland team. But I said to Robert, you made that three-pointer, it's been a great season. And Robert, it turns out, has been much more preoccupied with polar bears. And he's 12 years old, and he's sad and devastated and terrified that by the time he is your age, there may be no polar bears in the wild. And as any of you who are grandparents or parents know, it's one of the most difficult things to do is to try to empower your young people, to encourage them that, yes, the fight is worth doing, even though it looks very bleak. And we now have a full-time climate change expert, Mark McCaffrey, who is he's a very good person in this respect to help empower and give a positive sense of what we can do. We often think of ourselves as a crisis clinic, a building on fire approaching the waterfall, and actually stole this slide from one of Jeannie's PowerPoints. Here we have Glenn Branch, Deputy Director, Robert Lunn, our Outreach Director, myself, Josh Rosenau, Public Information, Steve Newton, a geologist who also works with local flare-ups, and Eric Meikle, who was here, I think, in 2001, and of course, Jeannie Scott. And I don't have a picture of Mark, who is our most recent hire, and other members of the staff as well. But we're a very vibrant staff of very varying backgrounds and approaches, but the thing that unites all of us is our passion for sound science teaching, regardless of all of our backgrounds. We have a very rich interchange of ideas. As far as what I do, I'm a Christian historical theologian, although I don't get much of a chance to write. My biggest effort in this regard was Catholicism and Science, which came out in 2008, and unfortunately it's a $65 hardback, and I was thinking of turning it into a paperback until someone recently said, why don't you go straight to Kindle? So we may do that. I've already mentioned this dimension. I love working with environmental ethics, and this was in Hawaii a few years ago when we were I brought my family for a conference, and we were at the Ka'ala Farm, which is a sustainable environmental farm to help indigenous Hawaiians both kick drugs and alcohol and reestablish their spiritual cultural roots. And my kids were thrilled to be allowed to wade knee-deep in mud and plant taro roots. I'm also a fellow of the International Society for Science and Religion, which I will mention later. It's a very large clearinghouse in England for issues related to religion and science. The reason I mentioned being a father of two students is that any of you who've had children know that they question from very early ages. And I've been thrilled at being able to communicate the love for science to my little ones. When Michael he's now a sophomore at Berkeley High, when he was 2, he asked me whether I could get him a book on cosmology. And I went to the Gaia bookstore in Berkeley thinking, well, they might have a book on cosmology. And I talked to this sort of hippie type person who was rather contemptuous. He said, we don't carry science, we only carry fringe science. I wasn't sure what that meant, but then I found many great books on cosmology. And Robert, when he was 3, he saw a book on my shelf called The God Hypothesis, and he was very interested in this. But he didn't know how to read. Well, he was just beginning to read. The next day he said, Daddy, I forgot. Does that say the dog hypothesis? And I was very interested that he remembered the word hypothesis, but he was unclear on the difference between dog and God. Michael, when he was 5, asked me, Dad, would you be upset if I told you that sometimes I question the existence of God? And I said, Michael, I think I would be upset if you told me you never did. And so they have always questioned all along, and so my wife's and my approach to teaching our children has been to encourage them to take this wonderful world that they're part of and question it and think about it and learn about every dimension that they can. So I'd like to begin with a personal narrative about interpreting the universe, because I think how we interpret the universe is very important. And I think it speaks to the difference in mentality and approach between the fundamentalist and the non-fundamentalist approach to the question of evolution. And so I'm going to give you a little narrative of something that happened to me 2 years ago and ask you, what if our world were entirely permeated by the assumption of an ancient, dynamic, evolving cosmos? How would it look to you? And this is a personal narrative of terror and exhilaration. Does anybody know what this mountain is?
Yes.
Okay, from what direction?
The north side.
The north side. Right, this is the Hotlamballen Ridge, and this is the Hotlam Glacier headwall. And I was on a climb with 2 friends, one of whom just turned 70 last year, but this was 2 years ago. And we were going to climb the Whitney Glacier and then come down by way of the Hotlamballen Ridge. What I didn't know was that they left without me, because I was at a conference in Tweed at College of the Siskiyous on environmental ethics in the Klamath Basin. And I didn't leave the car till 1. And by the time I got up to the glacier, they had already left. And I found myself alone at 9 o'clock at night looking for a place to sleep on the Whitney Glacier. And I had actually had a hallucination a few minutes before. I saw my friends talking with 2 other climbers that they met next to a snack shop. And I thought, wow, this is cool. I've met them, and there's a hot dog stand up here. And then a couple of minutes later, I realized I was having a hypoxia-induced hallucination, and that I was alone in shorts and a t-shirt on a glacier at 9 o'clock at night with a cold wind coming down, and I had no tent. So I didn't really want to sleep over there in the ice fall, so I decided this looked good. It looked out of the wind. And then I thought, well, I don't like the look of that cliff. And so I camped on this side of a esker of rocks. And it was a good thing, because at about 2 o'clock in the morning, there was a tremendous crash. And about a ton of rock fell off this cliff, right where I would have put my sleeping bag. So this was my apartment. The kitchen here, the bathroom was over here, the bedroom. And I had a very comfortable night. Absolutely gorgeous. Alone. My big sack and my down jacket kept me quite warm. But I woke up alone with a very high wind. Oh, this was the sunset, and the sunsets are incredible up there. And I heard coyotes howling at night from down the glacier among the little scrub pine trees. And I thought, what a privilege to be here, because very few people can be at 11,000 feet on the glacier watching the sunset. The intended route was to come down this steep face here, and I had a little accident in the crevasse field, which I'll mention in a moment. The next day I got up, and here were the... Okay.
Keep going for now, and I'll switch it.
Okay. The reason I was wanting to move back and forth is so that I don't obscure your view of the slide. So maybe I'll just do that silently, but I didn't want to just be standing the whole time in front of the screen for this side. Is that something I can hold?
That's why I'm on
Oh, that's okay, great.
Trim the little cable belt. That's what I'm doing. There we go. Close cable.
Okay, thank you.
So this one is irrelevant, I guess.
And this one is on. So the next morning, I found that the seracs, the blocks of ice, which I had hallucinatorily misinterpreted as people, they were simply blocks of ice. And I had to make my way up that through them. And I had to make my way also avoiding the gigantic crevasses. And any of you who climb know that the first rule is never to climb alone. But I had unintentionally climbed alone. You don't want to fall in a crevasse and have no one to bring you out. So I found my partner's footsteps and followed it around the bergschrund. Finally got up to the top of this slope at about 12,000 feet and met one of my partners, Kevin. We had another 2,000 feet to go, and Conrad, our 70-year-old partner, was way up there, way ahead of us. He climbed Baker with my son and me last summer, and it was just amazing. Well, we got up to the top, and we got into a horrible wind and snowstorm, and this was on June 21st, 2009. It was so bad that we could not even see the summit, which was a few hundred feet above us, and so we decided to beat a hasty retreat down the steep north side, and we got separated, and I ended up suddenly finding my right foot plunging through the snow into a crevasse up to my crotch, and simply took my ice axe and went like that and plunged it in the ice, and my momentum carried me over. And I sat there trembling until the whiteout lifted, and I realized I was right in the middle of the crevasse field, so I had to be very careful in looking for my partners. Eventually found them, got down to Timberline, which is down here. It was snowing, the snow had hidden the trail, and the whiteout completely obscured all indication of where the macro landmarks were. And so we wandered around until about midnight, and finally found a place to lie down, which we thought was in the little grove of trees, but it was a cutover area. I managed to get a call through to my son at 11:30 at night, and I said, and it's strange because you never get calls off the north side of Shasta, but I said, just tell Mom we're still alive, but we're out of food, out of gas, and out of water. And we'll find our way down the next day. So I guess that was reassuring. The next day we found the trail, and it was snowing, and I found myself singing Walking in a Winter Wonderland on the summer solstice. But this was a very strange sort of thing. Got down to the parking lot, and I wanted to meet my brother in Reading, who I hadn't seen for a while, and go to church with him because it was Father's Day. So I was sitting there in church. It was warm. I hadn't showered in 3 days, hadn't eaten in a day and a half. Started to sleep, and then the fire alarm went off. The church caught on fire. And my brother looked at me, he said, Peter, you're not really a lucky guy to be around this weekend. But it was a wonderful climb, and a wonderful human experience. And I was wondering, how does this narrative appear in light of an evolutionary worldview that we share? It seems to me that if you had been up there with me, you would have interpreted a sunset in terms of astronomy, in terms of chemistry, the physical chemical reactions of light in the atmosphere. You would have interpreted the human appreciation of a sunset in terms of the evolution of neuroscience, or the evolution of neurons, in such a way that it allowed us as a sentient species and a rational species to appreciate what we interpret as the physical and natural beauty of the world. An evolutionary worldview makes it very clear to me that Mount Shasta is 650,000 years old. It's a very old and multi-layered volcano with a tremendous history that antedates, or that is many times longer than human recorded history. An evolutionary worldview makes me appreciate how old glaciers are, not simply on Shasta, but on Greenland, in Antarctica, and how much we stand to lose through climate change, melting away all of this climate history and all of this stored water. An evolutionary worldview made me appreciate the effects of glaciation and carving of the vast walls on both sides of the Whitney Glacier, between Mount Shasta and Mount Shastina. And so I had the same feeling that James Hutton did in 1786 when he went to Sychar Point in Scotland and discovered the deep history of time, when he realized that what he was seeing was recorded as hundreds of thousands, if not millions and tens of millions of years of layers laid down. And so geological history is very much a part of that. And of course, the whole human dimension. I thought of the evolution of our human species and how it is that 3 half-crazed mountaineers decided to attempt this climb rather than staying and playing golf or going to Denny's. And how it is that the evolutionary history of our species has impelled us to do fascinating things over the years, and how we fit all of this together. In contrast, how would this narrative work if we imagined the world as young, static, and anthropocentric? I was in Colorado once, and I was with a humanist friend, and watching the sunset, and she explained, having been with a fundamentalist friend from Focus on the Family, who she was explaining to my humanist friend was explaining to her son the physics of the sunset. And the fundamentalist was saying, is that all you see? You don't see God's finger painting that? And so, I hadn't really thought how different the perspective might be. How different the perspective would be if you assumed that the Earth were 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and you had the monumental task of explaining how this giant hunk of rock called Mount Shasta, which we of the evolutionary sort imagine has a 600,000-year volcanic history, how it was all piled up in a few thousand years and affected by Noah's flood and so forth. And gee, it would have to be piled up a lot faster than that, because Noah's flood was 4,500 years ago, and Mount Shasta had to be piled up 14,000 feet high in that time. You have the question of what would have happened to the glaciers, which we know have a very long time of deposition behind them. All that would have to be compressed under a young, static, and anthropocentric worldview. In that view, of course, the entire universe was made for human beings and for our enjoyment of it. It does not take into account the needs or interests of other creatures, planet mates, possible evolved species on some of the planets surrounding the 10 to the 22nd stars in the universe. And so these two different perspectives, it seems to me, are very important when we try to imagine why there is a conflict between science and religion, or a perceived conflict. And so bearing imaginatively in mind how other people think about the world, I think is very important. And realizing that perspective is everything. I was at a conference a few years ago when a young lesbian scientist was recounting the experience she had at Año Nuevo Sea Lion Preserve. Was it sea lion or elephant seals? Año Nuevo. Elephant seals. And this young, straight, male docent had been droning on and on about how nothing much of interest happens for 11 months out of the year, but boy, the mating season is really interesting. And she said, he just dismissed 11 months of important homosocial behavior between female elephant seals. And I was thinking afterwards, you don't have to be a lesbian to recognize this, but it took a lesbian biologist to point out to me the absurdity of this docent's assumption that you can simply dismiss 11 months of behavior because it doesn't have to do with mating. So I always try to bear perspective in mind, and I should say that I'm aware that I am speaking to you as a middle-aged, straight, white, male, father of two, with a religious background, working for NCSE, and while we no doubt share many of those things, there are things we don't share, and there are many things we don't share with the rest of the world. And I think those differences are very important in estimating how we think differently, how we approach these questions. One of the most important differences between me and fundamentalists is that I do not assume that the entire universe was made 6,000 years ago for white Americans. Well, I'm sure that they would not say it's for white Americans, but that's the subtext. That here you have this nuclear family who's about to be raptured, and of course they know it's all about them. Whereas how do I know that the universe is all about me? I'm just one little package of evolved material on one planet around one of 10 to the 22nd stars, trying to make sense out of it. So I think it's a matter of perspective, and I won't go through that. I've already talked about the perspective issue, but you can see that there are different ways of viewing a mountain, depending on the type of lens you see it through. In contrast to the ancient universe, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, the default assumption of fundamentalists is the three-story universe and a recent creation. You have a medieval image of creation here, and Dante Alighieri's Geography of the Divine Comedy, and you've got hell, earth, purgatory, and heaven. Well, that's 4 stories. Maybe they added a parking structure there. But the three-story universe of heaven, purgatory, and hell, essentially, after earth is incinerated. Or heaven, earth, and hell, assuming now we put purgatory in limbo, so to speak. And throughout the Middle Ages, of course, this three-form structure, the arcade, the triforium, and the clear story being filled with light, told the story of that three-story universe in architecture. And I just found a couple of other pictures that I thought would be interesting for Americans or Brits. That I'm not sure why Earth and Purgatory are not in this. And I don't even know whether this is a real place. I assume there's a couple of towns like this. So in the ancient cosmology of the three-story universe, this is from a 19th century illustration. And fundamentalists often don't recognize or don't acknowledge that if they're going to take themselves literally, the Earth has to be flat, covered with a dome, with little holes to let in the rain, the hail, and so forth, and that there are, in fact, pillars and the Great Deep, although some of them will argue that there is the Great Deep, and that's what accounted for Noah's flood. But clearly, there's an assumption of the cogency of a three-story universe, which we no longer would even accept as cogent. I actually thought this was a much older image, but I found that it came from an 1888 publication where you see it. This is Camille Flammarion's assumption of what a medieval would think it must be like to go out to the edge of the stars and poke your head through and see the machinery that runs the universe. So you have ancient, sorry, I misspelled geocentric, Christian geocentric cosmology with Earth at the center, Sun and the planets, the primum mobile, or God's home, and you know, of course, how all of this unraveled from before Copernicus onwards until through a variety of different interpretations. Tycho Brahe's proposed geoheliocentric model up through Newton's. You have this wonderful 300 or 400 year cosmological shift that essentially pulled the rug out from under a literal understanding of the old cosmology. Oh, and I actually sometimes ask my students which of these is true, and unfortunately I'll get some of them who will say, well, the Copernican model is true, and then I say, well, you know, we didn't complete the story, we didn't go on. The story is continuing even today. So instead, what that's been replaced with in the last few hundred years has been the big story of the universe. And I showed this slide one time, and basically it's just a PowerPoint animation of a drawing, but some student thought it was my video of the Big Bang. We had an interesting discussion of scientific epistemology. Where would I have been to what privileged vantage point to take that video? I saw that could have gone on and consumed an entire class period, and I thought maybe the student was just trying to get some free time out of it. So we know that the Big Bang did not yield everything that we have, that we needed several generations of stars for nucleosynthesis. We needed supernovas to explode and spew all of this wonderful debris of heavier elements out into the galaxy, where it would be, where it would coalesce into. This is a very interesting table that shows where the different classes of or kinds of elements came from, what part of cosmological history, and how all of this came together into accretion disks, which then became stars surrounded by planets, and gradually into stable planetary systems, or at least ours. And from there, we go into terrestrial biological evolution with all of the elements that make life possible on Earth. And recently I was at a conference in Hawaii a couple of years ago where I heard some great talks on the big history movement. Very fascinating. And one person argues that you should begin a class in the French Revolution with the Big Bang. And it makes me sort of wonder how far you would get in a semester if you always began, of course, with the Big Bang. I think what it's meant is that you presuppose the grand history of the universe in everything human. So all of these aspects of evolution contribute to the story that all of us in this room, I presume, accept as the ancient, dynamic, and evolving universe, in contrast to the three-story cosmos assumed by many others. So I'm going to go rather quickly through religious responses to evolution and group them under rejection, guarded acceptance, and integration. And recognize that that's a very crude set of categories, because there's almost an infinite gradation between them. Oh, let me begin with a couple of cartoons that you may or may not have seen. We actually have a very nice collection of creation and evolution cartoons at NCSE. And I'm sure there are books that have been written on these. I like the one about Tiktaalik, no missing links. Oh, and he says, let's go hide in the fossil record. Now, Ian Barber, who's a great scholar of science and religion, wrote in his Religion in an Age of Science a proposal that the relationship between these two human institutions fall into four categories. Either conflict model, where religion swallows up science, or science swallows up religion. or the independence model, where the two are hermetically sealed off from each other in separate categories, or the dialogue model, where they maintain their own competence, but at important intersections like the origin of the universe, the far future of the universe, the nature of a claimed religious experience, the nature of consciousness, and so forth, they are tangent. And then there are some adventuresome souls who engage in what I don't think is possible, that is the integration model, integrating science and religion. Although I think that it's interesting to mention that that's part of the total spectrum. So when I'm dealing with creationist students, I will often begin with an analogy. I ask creation or evolution. Then I'll ask them, is this even a meaningful question? And the analogy is to show them this picture. Is this fruit spherical or is it orange? And usually I will find one student in the class who will say, well, it's a category mistake because those aren't conflicting. Although recently I gave this in a high school and I found out they were actually taking the analogy literally. And it was a very strange problem. I wasn't dealing with biblical literalism, I was dealing with analogical literalism, and they had a hard time getting beyond that. So what I point out is that just as orange and spherical are complementary ways of looking at a fruit, creation and evolution are not contradictory, but complementary ways of looking at the universe. To explain that, creation essentially falls into a metaphysical category. It's simply the belief that the universe depends for its existence on something outside of itself. Creation, properly interpreted, makes no claims about how or when the world came to be or whether creation was even an event or an act in time. It's a philosophical claim compatible with a variety of different religious beliefs. In contrast, evolution is in a scientific category. It's a biological theory that all life is related through descent with modification, and it's testable and well substantiated. Evolution, properly interpreted, does not make any claims about God's existence or non-existence. It's compatible with theism or atheism or agnosticism or numerous other isms. And so I think it's important to make this distinction between creation and evolution to show why it's possible to assume both that the universe depends on something outside of itself and to accept evolution entirely. Now, looking at what is creationism, properly speaking, from way back in Judeo-Christian history, creationism is simply the view that God created the world. The world depends on something outside of itself. However, popularly speaking, it has come to mean a young earth anti-contemporary scientific idea that it conflicts irreconcilably with evolution. Creationism too. But I think even more broadly considered, it's a spectrum of various sets of inconsistent assumptions. You'll notice that the computer that Adam is using is an Apple. As he puts God on hold to take this call. So, a number of years ago, I was wondering how you sort of map these different views. And I was thinking that if you have the science spectrum here and the theism spectrum here, you might be able to map the way different groups of religious and non-religious thinkers are by... sorry, if I sit down, can you see better?
Yeah.
Is that going to be okay?
Great.
So the Flat Earthers, who actually did have a website, but it's been down for a while. It was run out of a trailer in Lancaster, California. Are at the opposite end of the spectrum from theistic evolutionists, that is, theists who accept evolution, who are scientifically on the same level as non-theistic evolutionists like Richard Dawkins. So there's a vast difference here between the Flat Earthers, the geocentrics, of which Robert Sungenis is a current representative. He's a Roman Catholic who's published a book called Copernicus Was Wrong. It's a 900-page, 2-volume work. that I've never even bothered. Well, I've seen the proofs of it on the internet, but I wouldn't buy it. All the way to the younger. These are the young Earth creationists, represented by the Institute for Creation Research, Answers in Genesis, and Creation Research International. The gap theory. Actually, the omphalists, I should have mentioned them. Omphalos is the word for navel, and the omphalists, I'm not sure of the history of this, but in the 19th century, I think Philip Goss was speculating about whether Adam and Eve had navels, which they wouldn't have needed, but whether God would have created them with navels, just as God would have created redwood trees with the appearance of being thousands of years old, and stars with light already on the way to the earth. So omphalism touches upon this problem of what do you do with the perception that apparently the universe is 13.7 billion years old. Then you have the gap theory of old Earth creationists and the day-age theory. The gap theory people argued that there was a gap between let there be light and everything else, and that gap could account for the cosmological evolution, but presumably not for the evolution of species on Earth. Then you have the day-age people who would argue that each set of verses in Genesis accounts for a particular element of evolution. But of course, if you try to map that onto what we know about evolution, it simply doesn't work. The progressive creationists like Hugh Ross, who accept much of what we would see, what we would observe about science, but who would argue that it was done progressively by God. The intelligent design creationists, like the people at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, who argue that there are irreducibly complex phenomena that absolutely demand an explanation from beyond what science can offer. To all of the groups who are theistic evolutionists, Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences, Institute for ISSR, International Society of Science and Religion, International Institute for Religion and Age of Science, Zygon Center in Chicago, the Ian Ramsey Center in Oxford, Metanexus, and so forth, all of whom accept science just as you would, but who view it through theistic lenses. Then you've got the process thinkers like John Cobb, who argues that both God and the universe are evolving together, or co-evolving, so that the universe is a very interesting experiment to God, who is evolving as well. You've got, on the non-theistic side, you've got Stephen Jay Gould, who argued for the non-overlapping magisterial authorities, that science and religion are two magisterial authorities in two different camps that don't conflict because they don't speak to each other. To Stephen Weinberg, who argues that the more you study the universe, the more it appears to be absurd, and you create your own values within that. To Richard Dawkins, who is a great communicator about science and has stirred a good deal of controversy. I also threw in the Raelians, followers of a French race car driver who believes that that we were seeded by some other race from a different planet. So you can see that you could probably also map this three-dimensionally as well as two-dimensionally, and it would take forever to tease out all the different assumptions of the various groups. But clearly it's a very varied landscape. The line that I think is important to make, however, is the line of absolute acceptance of science here between theistic evolution and everything below it. Theistic and atheistic evolution and everything below it. Just a few slides about rejection. And I put creationism in the plural because I think it's important to recognize that there are many different kinds of assumptions about creationism. That's creationism superscript 2. I think one of the reasons that we have dispute is that there are many examples of incivility in general. Burn Another Religion's Sacred Text Day, Reverend Terry Jones in Florida. I'm out to show that their religion is just crazy haters. Ha 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 ha. And I was up in Ferndale and Eureka, and I found a wonderful example of incivility, Northern California style. I was going to post this on Facebook, but my son Michael who's very savvy, said, "Dad, I don't think you should be posting that 8 out of 10 voices in my head say don't shoot." Presuming that people check up on Facebook. So you know that we live in a very problematic culture with all sorts of hate going on between all sorts of groups, and you have to be very careful about it. But I think that contributes to the reason for dialogue being difficult. One example of creationism, the Answers in Genesis group in Kentucky, you may be aware of when they opened their creation museum 3 or 4 years ago in Kentucky, which is a very sciencey looking museum, deliberately placed in northern Kentucky, just below Ohio, I think, so that it would be within a day's drive of 2/3 of the American populace. And they imagined busloads of kids going there for science education, just as my kids go to the California Academy of Sciences, except that nothing much changes at the Creation Museum because everything was done 6,000 years ago. Recently, they decided to open this theme park with a life-size model of Noah's Ark, which I understand from Glenn Branch over lunch recently at work was they're encountering financial problems. They were arguing that they were advertising buying planks or pegs, like $10 buys you a peg, and $100 buys you a plank. They're finding it difficult to fund this park. Jeannie Scott, our director, on her Facebook page was answering a question. I guess they had a designer wondering about how to design the ride for the 10 plagues of Egypt. And she was wondering whether, for example, for lice, they would actually have lice distribution centers over the ride, so you'd have lice dropped on your head. And I wondered whether there should be a warning for parents that their firstborn children might not survive the ride. But apparently they don't want to take that literally. The fundamentalists would not want to interpret the 10 plagues literally, even though they want to interpret literally the story of Noah's Ark. On the Roman Catholic side, there's actually less creationism because historically Roman Catholicism has had less of a problem accepting evolution. But the Colby Center is a group on the East Coast that's it's a conservative Catholic group that is arguing essentially young Earthism, and they're connected with Christendom College, which has a geology department that actually no, it doesn't have a geology department. I think they solved the problem by not having any sciences. Science has to be taken outside the college. It's a liberal arts college. A third example is Victor Warkulowicz. He's a conservative Catholic priest who claims competence in, physics, astronomy, cosmology, biology, biochemistry, genetics, and about 10 other disciplines. And the book is a defense of a literal interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11. So why is creationism attractive? I think it's attractive for a variety of reasons. That humans crave security and order in a disordered and chaotic world. Humans want to read design into everything. And I like this Calvin and Hobbes cartoon where Calvin says, "Like delicate lace so the threads intertwine, a gossamer web of wondrous design, such beauty and grace wild nature produces. Ugh, look at the spiders suck out that bug's juices." So life is inherently messy when you get down to it. But, and evolution deals with that. I mean, Annie Dillard, has anybody read Pilgrim at Tinker Creek?
Yes.
It's an absolutely phenomenal book that I used in my graduate class at St. Mary's College in Morago for a number of years, and it's a real eye-opener. Annie Dillard was, I'm not sure what species of belief she had, but she was a naturalist, and she really wanted to deal with the whole problem of suffering in evolutionary nature. And she says, when you face the facts, look at it this way. Evolution is like a railroad CEO who wants to end up with 3 engines on his track. So he sets loose 9,000 engines on a series of tracks with no schedules and no switches and no signal lights. And you end up with an enormous number of horrific crashes, but you end up with 3 engines. She said it works, but it's a hell of a way to run a railroad. And yet, that's what evolution seems to want. if evolution wanted humans, why did it take 3.5 billion years on Earth with 3.5 billion years of incredible suffering? And I think that's a problem for creationism, how to deal with the whole problem of evolutionary suffering. Creationism is attractive because primates are aggressive and tribal, and we justify our behavior in our writings. And this has been going on for the whole length of human history. We are naturally anthropocentric, so naturally the story of Genesis is all about us. I try to point out that if rational spiders had evolved, and I recognize that there are significant problems with assuming that an arachnid could develop into the cognitive species like us, but let's say a reptile or something other than a mammalian platform, I'm sure their book of Genesis would be all about them. And Christians in particular have developed a theology of salvation, some Christians, that renders the natural world merely an incidental backdrop to their own story. I think it's attractive because we cling to various forms of scriptural inerrantism, even if they contradict science. And it's attractive because creationists worry that evolutionary biology is at least conducive to racism, feminism, irreligion, immorality, liberalism, drug use, teen pregnancy, voting for Democrats, and societal breakdown. And actually, there's a recent updating of that here where you see that Darwinism, I bet you didn't know that it led to promiscuity and, perversion. I'm sure there was a great deal, if anybody's read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, there's a lot of great stuff that went on in there long before Darwin came about. Most recently in Oakland, this was actually a few blocks from my house. Last May, Harold Camping of Family Radio in Oakland predicted the end of the world on May 21st. And we were going to have a Judgment Day party at NCSE, but we never got around to it. Had other things going. I was glad I got this because I wanted to have this sign, "Right lane must turn right." I thought that was quite appropriate for a fundamentalist. So as recently as this year, you've got this whole set of assumptions about the way the world works, dictating what a group of people think the world is really about. And here's another, this is Answers in Genesis' own version of this, that, creation is going to be firing at the castle of evolution. I won't go through the history of creationism much, except to say that there has been a long history, and you can read about it on our NCSE website, a long history of the evolution of creation, evolution of creationism, from arguing that evolution is a theory in crisis, to the idea that it's either Bible or Darwin, to more recent attempts to be fair and teach both in class, and there are various other attempts to deal with creationism in school. Here's a recent survey. I should include, you are here. The United States is just above Turkey in terms of acceptance of evolution. Well below Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, France, and all these other countries. Roughly 40% of American adults accept a young Earth about 10,000 years old and a worldwide flood. Now, a recent mutation of this has been intelligent design, which attempts to argue, and again we have a history of this at NCSE, that we know when intelligent design came about in 1987, because we have the smoking gun. We know that they cut and pasted incorrectly from a creationist book and substituted the word intelligent design. This cartoon suggests the teacher is saying that school's intelligent design policy only applies to biology class, Kenny, not to mathematics. But that would be a whole other lecture in itself. Here are some intelligent design books, including Explore Evolution, that we have been working on a detailed refutation of at NCSE, because this was meant to be a supplementary textbook for children that would call into question what they are learning in their biology books. And of pandas and people, a central intelligent design textbook. The group to which I belong, or one of the groups, is the International Society for Science and Religion, and I think this is important to include this slide. They put out a statement a few years ago that we believe intelligent design is neither sound science nor good theology. Although the boundaries of science are open to change, allowing supernatural explanations to count as science undercuts the very purpose of science, which is to explain the workings of nature without recourse to religious language. And you can find this on the ISSR website, which we have a link to. So it's important that this major international organization came out in 2008 squarely against intelligent design. As far as guarded acceptance, I just have a few things to say about this. I like this quotation from Sir Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal, a couple of years ago, who argues that those who aren't aware of this great history are culturally deprived. That not only are they scientifically deprived, but they are culturally deprived. Because the new story of a 13 billion-year-old universe with its magnificent evolution, the cosmological evolution, planetary, chemical, biological, neurological evolution, ending in us who are able to stand around talking about these things today. That's a wonderful story. And to simply wipe all of that out and postulate a 6,000-year-old universe placed here as we see it is depriving people of a huge cultural source of truth. St. Augustine of Hippo, who is a fairly important figure in Christianity, himself argued 1,600 years ago that it's shameful for a Christian to write ignorantly about subjects which philosophers, that is, scientists, know well. And I think St. Augustine would be fairly horrified to see what young Earth creationism and intelligent design are doing today. And a few hundred years after him, Albert the Great, a bishop who was a scientist for the time as well as a theologian, argued that both are extremely important. He did a lot of work on science. And so in the history of the Catholic Church, there's been a strong interest in science. I put this slide up mainly because to show you that if you go to the Vatican website, www.vatican.va, you can get virtually every statement that's been made about science and religion by a pope. It's a great resource. However, I want to include this quote from Pope Pius in 1950 as an example of guarded acceptance, because this is a very famous encyclical in which he argued that it's permissible to look into the evolution of the human body, but it's not permissible to look into the evolution of the human soul. And there's a lot of very interesting work being done by Catholic theologians and others on the evolution of soulishness. What does it mean to assume that human nature evolved like everything else in the universe, and that the things that we call marks of the soul, that is rationality, moral responsibility, a sense of humor, an apprehension of the world, why would these not have evolved? Why could they not have evolved rather than being simply infused? And so Humani Generis is a grudging concession to science in some respects. This was written by a friend of mine, Michael Lodall, at Point Loma Nazarene University, and he's actually an amazing Nazarene thinker, well beyond most people in his communion. But he argued to me in his email last week that within the Nazarene Church, there are many who accept science exactly as all of us would, but there are others who are cautious about it and only willing to go so far. And likewise, I won't read these, but a friend of mine who's in the Disciples of Christ, who's an amazing thinker, also argues that at the denominational level, the Disciples of Christ has too much friction from people of the young earth imaginative variety. I argued a few years ago in an article that is available on the web that I think a lot of time and energy has gone into public discussion because it's at cross purposes due to linguistic confusion. And the confusing scientific and metaphysical discourse is philosophically improper and destructive to the integrity of both. And so I think language has, understanding language can go a long way towards helping us to understand or to integrate and accept evolutionary thinking. So the final sort of section I want to look at here is the evolutionary hermeneutic. Hermeneutics is the art and science of interpretation, translation of meaning across time, geography, cultural, and scientific boundaries. And who is the winged figure, by the way? Mercury or Hermes. And one of my students immediately, he missed the point about what I was saying, but he said, you know, this is aerodynamically impossible. Those tiny wings on the heels of that guy would not carry them at all. So we had a 15-minute side trip into the physics of aerodynamics, which was very interesting. That's not my picture. So the question is, and this is really central to the fundamentalist project, is interpreting a text written, well, what modern textual scholars would know was written over several thousand years, or at least 1,500 years, and was edited and re-edited by many different authors, many different communities of scholarship, and including many different genres, from poetry to poetry to history to law to mythology and symbolism. And in the literalist hermeneutic, you say, well, it's all to be taken literally. But most modern scholars, most mainstream religious scholars, Jewish and Christian and otherwise, would say that's not necessarily true. You have to take the text in context. I include this quote from Daniel Dennett's Darwin's Dangerous Idea because I think it's very interesting. He's asserted that the theory of evolution is a universal acid that eats through just about every traditional concept and leaves in its wake a revolutionized worldview with most of the landmarks still recognizable but transformed in fundamental ways. And I would say that's absolutely true, but it's old news to theologians who, for at least the last 150 years, since the mid-19th century discovery that the Bible has a history, have been aware that it's very important to place theology in context. And I'm going to just point out one thing here that I think is important, and that I tell my students, that theology is a living dialogue between the faith of a believing community and the culture in which it's embedded. A theology that is not challenged and transformed as the scientific culture changes is not really a living theology at all, but only the fossilized relic of a once living tradition. So I think a lot of fundamentalism is a fossilized relic of an imagined ideal culture of the Old Testament. But all you have to do is go to the Atheist Bible available on the web and look at some of the wonderful ways that the people who pulled out these horrific texts of child sacrifice and telling judges to go in and dash the heads of little ones against stones, you have to say, wait a minute, that's not really good stuff there. So if a fundamentalist wants to take Scripture literally, there are going to be real problems with doing that. And so I think it's absolutely important for people of any theological stripe, or none at all, to recognize that a theology is a living dialogue, and that when it stops being a living dialogue, it stops being anything at all. Recent books include, there are just a lot of books relating to religion and science and how one interprets them. Hundreds and hundreds come out every year. So I won't go into any of them, but a lot of them are by people who, religious believers, who are attempting to make sense out of their tradition in light of science, and in light of a genuine and honest acceptance of science. All theologies presuppose a cosmology. Theology must be responsive, or it ceases to be relevant. All traditions have come to birth in a brief window of hospitable terrestrial conditions. Religious believers must acknowledge the temporary nature of this hospitability and ask themselves, how do we rethink theology for an ancient, dynamic, and evolving universe? And let me explain what I mean by this evolutionary hermeneutic. I found very interesting a couple of books by Peter Ward and Donald Brownlee, particularly their book on the life and death of planet Earth, how the new science of astrobiology charts the ultimate fate of our world. And they point out that there was no macro life for the first 3 billion years until about the 4 billion year mark. And this is the window we inhabit now, about 1 billion years of plants and animals. And that after about 5 billion years, the increasing solar luminosity as the sun burns off its hydrogen into helium and heavier elements will mean the sun will begin to expand and the solar wind will begin to strip away the atmosphere and the oceans until we are a burned cinder. And right now we're in the middle of that period. A couple of years ago I was lecturing at my son's school and I made the mistake of underestimating their concept of time. And I said we only have 500 million years left of major animal and plant life. And this one kid wondered whether we could finish recess. So I have to be careful when talking to younger people and make sure that I'm on their wavelength because they have their own social location that's different from mine. In this unique window of time have developed all the wonderful ecologies that we know and love and have evolved every species, all primates, every human culture, every religious experience or philosophy or scientific worldview, and in fact every theological system. All of these have evolved in this brief window of time, requiring us to think, what's it going to be like when this window is no longer hospitable? And I don't have time to go into it, but I have another whole lecture for theological audiences in which I go through 6 major areas of discussion: the problem of evil, the problem of life after death, the problem of the origin of the universe, the evolution of the human person, and various other doctrines. And I say, okay, how are you going to think intelligibly about this religious doctrine in light of an ancient, dynamic, and evolving cosmos? So what I want to conclude with here is just some representative denominational perspectives to suggest what some of the major religious groups are doing. One of the things that's important to know about is the Clergy Letter Project, which I mentioned at the beginning. Michael Butler, his picture I think I have, oh no, what happened to his picture? There he is, Michael Zimmerman. Used to be at Butler University in Indiana. He's now at Evergreen in Washington. He's an atheist biologist, I think, who was so concerned about the problem of communication with religious groups that he decided to put together the Clergy Letter Project. And what it involves is a very brief statement about science and its compatibility with religious belief. And I won't even go through it, but you can read a little bit about it here. It's now been signed by nearly 13,000 Christian clergy and 450 rabbis. And recently, after some problems with Islam in England, a Muslim cleric, a Muslim biologist, who's also an imam, whose biology students, medical students, were trying to get out of the evolution section of his class. They decided to start an imam letter, and I don't know how many signatories there are. But, you know, it's interesting to me that 13,000 Christian clergy in this country have signed this letter saying that it's ridiculous to assume that our little minds can limit what a creator might or might not have been doing in terms of thinking about the universe and accepting evolution as a foundational truth. The United Methodist Conference, I had some dialogue recently with someone who argues that that Methodism now is finding no conflict between religion and science. Their petition from the 2008 conference endorsed the Clergy Letter Project. Goes on record as opposing the introduction of any faith-based theories such as creationism or intelligent design into the science curriculum of our public schools. Methodism is a more liberal side of the spectrum here. The Episcopal Church, also fairly liberal, recognizes the theory of evolution provides a fruitful and unifying scientific explanation for the emergence of life on Earth, and resolves that standards for science education be based on the best available scientific knowledge. Pope John Paul II updated Humane Generis of 1950 in a sense, arguing that evolution is absolutely crucial to our understanding of the way the world works, although I believe that he still puts a protective belt around the human soul and would reject as heresy my attempt to interpret the evolution of human moral responsibility and rationality as part of a natural progression of evolution. The present Pope, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, in Communion and Stewardship, very clearly states that it's been demonstrated that all living organisms are genetically related, and it's virtually certain that all organisms have descended from the first, including all human beings. And therefore, some theory of evolution to account for the development and diversification of life on Earth is essential. Even down to the origin of the human species in Africa about 150,000 years ago. In 2009, I went to a wonderful conference in Rome, attended by 300 philosophers, theologians, scientists, and historians, and one creation scientist from Turkey who crashed the conference and grabbed the microphone and had to be physically wrestled away from the microphone. But it was a wonderful conference exploring the import of evolution for religious belief. The Lutheran Church, this again is a fairly liberal view. The Wisconsin and Missouri Synod Lutherans would not be in touch with the the ELCA. Well, the church shouldn't be in the business of blessing one scientific theory or another. Should we have adopted Newtonian physics, for example? Rather, our statements below demonstrate that ELCA's approach has been to show solid support for good science. And Genesis is not to be understood literally, even though it offers profound truth about God, humans, and the rest of nature. Sound science from molecular biology, embryology, physiology, anatomy, and related fields, and so forth. I even got an email this morning from a Greek Orthodox friend who apologized. He's a biologist as well as a Greek Orthodox priest, and said that Orthodox Christians range from sexually creationists to theistic evolutionists. They acknowledge that within his own church there is a vast spectrum. John Hott, a Catholic theologian at Georgetown University, argues in Deeper Than Darwin that one refusal to see depth in nature is intelligent design, which refuses to look beneath the veneer of design to the tortuous history of evolution. The final couple of slides have to do with scientific naturalism. And I have my wife Vivian to thank for this cartoon. She found it at work. She works at UCSF, and she just thought this was great. This little praying cat with his little atheist friend. Cute, but ultimately futile. So there I had to get a bit of feline cute in. A couple of very important scientific naturalist thinkers. Michael Dowd, who has said some remarkable things about the idolatry of the written word. And it's not unique to him, but he put it in a unique way. This idolatry occurred anywhere in the world where ancient oral stories, which evolved for millennia as conditions and needs changed, became frozen into unchanging scripture. And that's always struck me as very odd that you would think that I regard the Old Testament as the Jewish people's sort of diary of their coming to understanding of a relationship with the being that they thought of as God. I didn't think of it as literal history, but for a literalist, that becomes enshrined and encapsulated and frozen as the truth. Ursula Goodenough, another naturalist thinker, loves the epic of evolution, which is a story beautifully suited to anchor our search for planetary consensus, telling us of our nature, our place, our context. Moreover, responses to the story, what we are calling religious naturalism, can yield deep and abiding spiritual experiences. And The Sacred Depths of Nature is a very interesting book. So in conclusion, what can we say here? I would argue that people in ancient faith traditions recognize that religion has everything to gain from an incisive engagement with science. And what I would do if I had another couple of days is talk about what theology looks like if it takes science seriously. What does it look like? What does the religious approach to suffering look like if we take seriously 3.5 billion years of evolutionary suffering? And likewise, what does science and its object look like if we approach them with religious faith? The interpretive framework within which a theistic evolutionist reads the Bible, church history, doctrinal theology, and religious ethics, I would say must inevitably reflect an unimaginably vast, ancient, dynamic, and evolving universe. And therefore, it's essential for their coherence that religious traditions integrate the evolutionary worldview into their theologies and religious cultures. And I would say, in light of something that has distracted me in the last 2 weeks, namely the whole flap about artificial contraception, it strikes me that you've got a religious tradition that is flat out refusing to integrate the evolutionary worldview. And how I would relate that to evolution is that humans have been so successful at decreasing infant mortality that we no longer have to have 19 children like the Dugars to ensure that some will be able to help run the plows when we're old at 35. And therefore we've been remarkably successful at fulfilling the mandate of Genesis 1:26, go forth and multiply and cover the face of the earth. And so from an evolutionary perspective, it seems to me absolutely reasonable that a species like ours has developed the science and technology to be able to control our conception. And a religious tradition that refuses to see that, refuses to integrate this evolutionary worldview into theology and religious culture. Secondly, in a pluralistic society such as ours, the interests of science and secularism cannot reasonably demand the erasure of all cultural traditions that do not meet the rigorous demands of reductionist science. I've encountered secularists on the atheist side who say we should expunge all religion, we should erase all mention of religion and spiritual tradition and pretend they never happened. But I'm not sure that that helps. I think that those things are important for our culture. While only science belongs in the science classroom, there is room in our educational system for introducing students to some of the many religious and philosophical traditions developed by humankind over the last 5,000 years. My 6th grader Robert is having a wonderful time learning about Egyptian mythology and burial practices in the last couple of weeks. And he's just really gotten into this. And I find it amazing that he's looking at a culture that has been dead for thousands of years, making it his own, asking himself, what did these people think? What did they hope? What were their fears? And to him, it's very real and very important. Not something to be thrown out or swept under the rug. So that's essentially as far as I want to go today, because it could take weeks and months to tease out everything of interest. But I wanted to present you with a bit of the spectrum from rejection to integration of what religious communities today are doing with the idea of an ancient, dynamic, and evolving cosmos. Thank you.
Okay, folks, I want to thank Dr. Hess for his presentation today. We are not going to have enough time for questions, unfortunately. So what I'm going to direct you toward in the time we do have left is the refreshments and the birthday cake, because after all, it wouldn't be a birthday without cake. Enjoy.